Hamas does everything in its power to put Palestinian civilians in harm's way.
Hamas needs to stop hiding behind human shields.
The ICC prosecutor accuses Israel of deliberately targeting civilians. What in God's green earth is he talking about?
Israel has flattened an apartment building, killing scores of people, including children. What is the first thing you hear? Hamas is using human shields. It's impossible to avoid this line when talking about almost any instance where Israel has targeted civilians in Gaza. It's ubiquitous, and more importantly for this video, it's almost always used wrong. When we discuss when an army is allowed to engage in a strike where civilians will be killed, the question of the averred target using human shields is always brought up as a defense for the legality or right to engage in the strike. Obviously, this involves a matter of international law, and unsurprisingly, you can't use a human shield under international law. But regarding Gaza and the use of human shields, people get the following things wrong. 1. That the use of human shields serves as a defense for when civilians are targeted. 2. That the use of human shields occurs generally or whenever a militant group operates in civilian areas. And 3. That only Hamas has used human shields. Each of these assumptions are wrong for factual and legal reasons, which I will discuss after I plug my Patreon to you guys and tell you to subscribe. If you enjoy content like this and want to support me in making it, please consider joining as a patron. If that's too much to ask, please consider subscribing. Around 70% of the people who watch my videos aren't subscribed. Anyway, on to the rest of the video. The use of human shields is illegal under international law. If Party A is found using human shields in order to impede Party B's military conduct, Party A has violated international criminal law. However, what does this mean for Party B? Can they kill the civilians that Party A is using as a human shield? The answer is, it depends. The principle of distinction and the principle of proportionality still apply. For those who are curious, the principle of distinction is an international law rule mandating that parties to a conflict distinguish between civilian and military targets, and the principle of proportionality forbids parties from attacking military targets where the expected civilian death toll is disproportionate to the expected military gain. The prohibition of using human shields is such that it legally affects the party using human shields. The use of a human shield does not allow the enemy party to drop whatever bomb they'd like, completely ignoring the proportionality of the attack or the need to distinguish between civilians and militants. This view is not ubiquitous. Countries such as the United Kingdom view the use of human shields as being a factor in the proportionality analysis. But a difference of opinion from a few countries does not create a new international law rule. The text of Additional Protocol 1 forbidding the use of a human shield says,
"Any violation of these prohibitions shall not release the parties to the conflict from their legal obligations with respect to the civilian population and civilians."
So, proving Hamas has used a human shield, a violation of the prohibition, does not release Israel from having to distinguish between civilians or use proportionate attacks, their legal obligations. There is also a level of nuance where civilians act as voluntary human shields. However, there is not a particularly strong case that voluntary human shields lose their civilian status, and there is no consensus suggesting this would be the case. The use of a human shield is something which has very few cases addressing the matter under international law, and generally, the distinction between voluntary and involuntary human shields is mainly a matter spoken of in the opinion of jurists, which isn't nothing, but it's not enough to create a binding rule under international law. Regarding Israel's conduct in Gaza, This would mean that asserting that Hamas is using human shields, assuming for the sake of argument that this is true, has little to no impact on the legality of the strike. Israel still needs to show that the strike is proportionate, and as I argue in my Israel is targeting civilians video, this is not the case. So, generally speaking, when can we find that a party has used human shields? Let's first dispel a notion that I feel a lot of pro-Israel commentators think meets the standard, that operating in a civilian area is a form of using human shields. In short, operating in a civilian area is not enough to show that someone is using civilians as a human shield. If you think about it for a second, this makes sense. At some point, where two parties go to war and where the objective is to take enemy territory, some of that territory is going to have some sort of civilian use. It is inevitable that fighting will take place in the streets and buildings of cities when those cities are under attack. Now, let's be clear. For parties such as Hamas and to a lesser extent Israel, who have military targets in civilian areas, in Israel's case the IDF HQ in Tel Aviv, issues under international humanitarian law still arise. But they arise under the defending party's obligation to take precautions against the effects of attacks, and not the prohibition of using a human shield. The Additional Protocol 1, which covers this issue, says that parties to the
maximum extent feasible must endeavor to remove the civilian population, individual civilians, and civilian objects under their control from the vicinity of military objectives, and avoid locating military objectives within or near densely populated areas.
This means that IHL asks defending parties to refrain as much as feasibly possible from locating military targets in civilian areas. Now, what feasible looks like is obviously up for debate. That being said, failing to adequately take precautions does not necessarily always translate into violating international criminal law, meaning you wouldn't be able to send either Israel or Hamas officials to jail if you could prove they violated this rule. It is also most definitely not a form of using a human shield. The actual standard for determining when a party has used a human shield is much stricter. To prove someone has used a human shield, you must prove 1. That the perpetrator moved or otherwise took advantage of the location of one or more civilians or other persons protected under the international law of armed conflict, and 2. That this was done with the intent to shield a military objective from attack or shield, favor, or impede military operations. The level of intent required is very strict. To prove intent, you must show that the perpetrator had specific intent. This means that you need to show that they knew what they were doing and desired the consequences of their actions to take place. This is the same level of intent that is required to prove genocide. Turning towards actual instances in which human shields were used, we'll find that Israel and Hamas have used human shields throughout this war. But Hamas's use of human shields is not as ubiquitous as people have claimed, and of course provide next to zero legal justification for any Israeli attack which has targeted civilians or which has killed a disproportionate number of civilians. Israel, on the other hand, has used human shields multiple times throughout this war, to an extent to which it's extremely odd that this is an accusation only lobbed at Hamas. I'm going to be looking at uses of human shields from October 7th, 2023 to January 2025, where a ceasefire has finally been announced. Starting with Hamas, Human Rights Watch found 2 instances where Hamas used Israelis as human shields during their assault on October 7th. In Be'eri and Nahal Oz, respectively, Al-Qassam fighters took Israeli civilians and threatened to shoot them if the IDF attacked, and also held another Israeli and used him to knock on doors. Generally speaking, though we have very little information on where hostages have been located, it would also be accurate to say that Hamas has been using the hostages as human shields during the duration of the war, since the entire point of having hostages is to make launching certain attacks less likely. Even if Israel still followed through on killing the hostages in a strike, this would not make Hamas's use of them as human shields any less illegal, because the use of a human shield is a conduct crime. Regarding Palestinian civilians, the evidence is much more scant. One instance in which a captured Hamas cadre explicitly asserted that they were using Palestinians as human shields was done under interrogation, and Hamas ultimately denied this. Considering the likelihood that torture was involved in this confession, this should be dismissed and ignored. There have been other cases wherein Hamas has told civilians not to heed Israeli evacuation orders. Hamas argues that this was done to prevent the population from falling to Israeli psychological warfare. In my opinion, issues like these are a coin flip. You need to determine what the intent of Hamas officials are here. If it is to actually use the civilian population as a human shield, or as Amnesty described in a previous round of Israeli attacks, that it is motivated by a desire to minimize panic and displacement. There have also been allegations that Hamas is physically preventing people from evacuating. However, these allegations come from Israel, and the UN's independent inquiry was not able to authenticate the evidence Israel presented. Human Rights Watch was also unable to verify these claims via interviews with Gazans. Ending with Israel, despite the fact that it's almost undiscussed, Israel has blatantly used human shields several times since October 7th. It is so common that soldiers call it the mosquito protocol. They force Palestinians to enter buildings so that, if there are any booby traps, they will explode and not us. The Israelis have even used minors to act as human shields, forcing them to wear military fatigues, and as one Palestinian detainee explained, "They used me as a human shield, taking me into demolished houses, places that could be dangerous or contain landmines." Another Palestinian, named Ramez Escafi, was detained, separated from his family, and forced to become a human shield. He reported that,
"I tried to resist their proposal, but they started beating me, and the officer told me it was not my choice to make, and that I have to do whatever they want."
He also alleged that the IDF would threaten Hamas fighters that they would kill him during firefights, saying,
"During that period, they used me as a human shield. I was in the middle. They said to the resistance fighter, 'Give yourself up or we'll kill this civilian.'"
As this video comes to a close, I would like to emphasize one thing, that the main point of the claim that Hamas is using human shields is not to make a point based in international law, but to use a phrase people clearly do not understand in order to justify criminal conduct. In short, it's rhetoric. You can easily speculate, without evidence, on the use of a human shield anytime civilians in Gaza are killed by Israel. But as I hope I have demonstrated, it's much harder to prove this. The point of speculating like this is to cast doubt onto claims that Israel's attacks are illegal, without actually providing evidence of the use of a human shield and without an understanding of what the use of a human shield even looks like. It must also be added that it never justifies killing civilians. It's a rhetorical claim that is flawed on almost every level. It's a rhetorical claim that is flawed on almost every level. I also must note that this rhetoric is only used one way. Israel is almost never accused of using civilians as human shields. And the problem there is that accusing Israel of using a human shield is extremely well founded. The behavior has consistently been reported as being common among the ranks of the IDF. As of writing this, a ceasefire has been announced. But it is still so important to recognize the harmful imbalance in the portrayal of the use of human shields. Despite a ceasefire, we are not in the clear. Fighting might resume as it has time and time again, and we're going to have to change how we talk about this issue so more innocent people are not slaughtered. Okay, everybody, video over, and now it's time to thank the patrons. All $7 and up patrons get a small shout out at the end of the video. So that would be Avocado Kirby, Bicep, Plum, Rod B, Pyrotic Napalm, and A Columbus. Thank you guys so much for your support, and thank you all for watching. Have a good night.